The amount of things one could say about Shoghi Effendi is far more than you could say in 40 minutes or an hour. My original slideshow had 80 slides, and I've now cut it down to 40, and I could easily have spent 2 or 3 minutes on each slide. One could easily do an entire weekend on Shoghi Effendi. We have an entire course called the Ministry of Shoghi Effendi for the Wilman Institute, and the amount of study that one could do is really a lifetime in length, and the impact of Shoghi Effendi on the Baha'i faith cannot be underestimated. Even if one were not to recognize him as the guardian of the cause of God, as someone divinely inspired and guided, one would have to recognize him as one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century in terms of understanding of the forces at work, the nature of the historical events that are occurring, the direction, the arrow of time and where we're moving as a human race, the insights he had, his ability to write about them, the strong language that he used, the clarity of his writings are something that really are matchless. They're quite a remarkable thing. And like I said, one would have to recognize him as a 20th century genius, even if one didn't recognize a spiritual source to his guidance as well. Of course, in some ways one needs to start with the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha, because that, of course, is the thing that set the ministry of Shoghi Effendi and the guardianship in motion. He revealed the Will and Testament in 3 different parts between 1902 and 1910. And in these parts, he designated Shoghi Effendi as his successor and also the Universal House of Justice as his successor. There were twin institutions and twin successors to Abdu'l-Baha, and he elaborated upon their relationship to each other and how the Universal House of Justice was eventually to be formed, how it was to be elected, and how the guardian was to choose a future guardian as well. So he, in his Will and Testament, defined the institutions of the guardianship and the Universal House of Justice in great detail. And in many ways, you could say that the ministry of Shoghi Effendi was a ministry to carry out the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha. That's one of the 3 documents that were crucial for Shoghi Effendi's ministry. And I should also add that in the Will and Testament, Abdu'l-Baha defines the institution of the hands of the cause of God. Baha'u'llah had already appointed hands. Abdu'l-Baha had appointed hands. Now he made it clear that Shoghi Effendi was to appoint hands of the cause of God, and he gave them certain specific roles in the growth of the faith as well, and he gave them a kind of spiritual rank as officers of the faith that was very important and that Shoghi Effendi elaborated upon, especially in the last few years of his life. Here's a really sweet picture of Shoghi Effendi as a young boy of perhaps 6 or 8. I don't know exactly how old he was in this picture. He was born on March 1st of 1897, and he was the oldest of Abdu'l-Baha's grandchildren. His mother was the oldest of Abdu'l-Baha's daughters. Abdu'l-Baha had had sons, but they had all died in infancy. 4 daughters survived to adulthood. All of them had children, and Shoghi Effendi was the very first grandchild of the oldest daughter also. As soon as he was born, Abdu'l-Baha insisted that everybody use the term Effendi, Shoghi Effendi, to refer to him. It's a sort of honorific in Turkish, Effendi. And so he was always, even as a little boy, called Shoghi Effendi. And immediately, Abdu'l-Baha established a school in Abdu'l-Baha's own house to educate the children of the household. So Shoghi Effendi at first went to a school right there in the house of Abdu'l-Baha on the first floor, sort of if you go in the entranceway on the left, there was a classroom that was used. And first there was a Persian gentleman who taught the classes, and then later an Italian lady who taught the classes. And so Abdu'l-Baha immediately was educating the children, including Shoghi Effendi. There's some more pictures of him as a little boy on the left hand and as a younger, not yet, probably about 10 or 11-year-old boy on the right, with a book in his hand, of course, which was in some ways rather characteristic of him. After the education at home, he went to the Collège des Frères in Haifa, which was a Jesuit private school. So he was, I think, living at home and just walking to school every day. Later on, there was a Jesuit boarding school in Beirut, which presumably was better. He didn't like the Collège des Frères in Haifa, so they sent him up to Beirut. Then, of course, in 1912, when he was 14 going on 15, Abdu'l-Baha left for America, and he was invited to go with Abdu'l-Baha on his trip to the United States and Canada. He boarded the ship with Abdu'l-Baha in Egypt, got as far as Naples, and when they were in Naples, Amin Farid, who was one of Abdu'l-Baha's nephews, Amin Farid's mother was the sister of Abdu'l-Baha's wife, Monireh Khanum, and Amin Farid said Shoghi Effendi's eyes were diseased, and they wouldn't allow him to continue on to America. They'd turn him back. So Abdu'l-Baha said fine, he had to go back. And he was sent back with one of the cooks on the entourage as well. This was a devastating thing for Shoghi Effendi. His eyes were fine. Amin Farid just simply wanted to get rid of Abdu'l-Baha's oldest grandson so that he would be the only relative of Abdu'l-Baha on the trip. And he often said, you know, I'm Abdu'l-Baha's nephew. He said this with a certain amount of pride to newspapermen while he was on the trip. So Shoghi Effendi went back, was devastated, lost weight and everything. Never did like the French high school he was going to in Beirut. So they sent him on in October of 1912 to the high school associated with the Syrian Protestant College. Today that's called the American University of Beirut and is one of the fine educational institutions in the Middle East. When he was 15, he started this preparatory school. He graduated a year later in summer of 1913 at age 16, and he was then ready to go to college. This is not too unusual. In those days, high schools were not a standard thing yet, and so kids went to college sometimes as early as age 14 or so. So that was the way it worked. In the summer of 1913, Abdu'l-Baha was back in Egypt, and Shoghi Effendi was able to go see him there. And then in the fall, he went to Syrian Protestant College for 4 years, 1913 to 1917, completing his bachelor's degree. Now, of course, World War I began in 1914, and the Americans eventually came into the war on the side of the English and the French. The Ottoman Turks were aligned with the Germans, and so this put Syrian Protestant College in a very awkward position. Theoretically, it could be closed, and all of the Americans either shipped out of the country or sent off to a concentration camp to be, watched. But the Syrian Protestant College instead insisted on absolute neutrality, that they would not have anything to do with the war, and they provided medical care to the Turkish soldiers. So Syrian Protestant College was allowed to continue to operate during the war, and it was a haven of safety. So Shoghi Effendi was in a safe place at a time when the whole area of the Middle East was really quite chaotic. Of course, there was a famine down in Haifa right before the British occupation, British invasion and occupation of Palestine. But Shoghi Effendi at that time was at Syrian Protestant College and was safe. He graduated in 1917 in a graduating class of 10 with his bachelor's degree. He then was a graduate student for 1 year until the summer of 1918, at which point General Allenby took Haifa, which made sure protected Abdu'l-Baha, and then Shoghi Effendi was able to go back to Haifa to serve as Abdu'l-Baha's secretary. Of course, in those days, you could take the train from Beirut to Haifa. There was no real border. There was today a big, highly fortified border, but in those days it was not a problem. So he was Abdu'l-Baha's secretary for a year and a half until the spring of 1920, and he mostly dealt with the correspondence from the West. You'll see many tablets of Abdu'l-Baha in Star of the West from this period of time translated by Shoghi Rabbani. He also met many pilgrims, and he worked so hard he even caught malaria. So he was really, really serving his master as well as he could. Because of that bout with malaria, he went to Paris for several months in 1920, resting in the morning, walking in the afternoon. From Paris, he decided to apply to Oxford as a non-collegiate student, and then he arrived in London in mid-July of 1920 in order to secure the recommendations that he needed to go to Oxford. He went to Balliol College at Oxford and arranged to be admitted there as a sort of temporary student. He wasn't really matriculated in degree exactly. And as soon as they agreed that he could come, even though the semester didn't begin in October, he started right away in August to begin to study. So he was fully matriculated in January, completed 3 trimesters in 1921, and was in his 4th trimester in the fall of 1921, when, of course, Abdu'l-Baha passed away. He was ostensibly there to improve his English so he could be a better translator for Abdu'l-Baha. But, of course, this is one of the places where he read Gibbon and many of the other books that he later came to love very much. One non-Baha'i who met him at Oxford, one of his fellow students, said this: Rabbani was irrepressibly cheerful, always on the point of laughter and bouncing around. Wherever he was, spirits were high. We all knew him destined for spiritual leadership. And believe me, in no sense of irreverence or discourtesy, he was affectionately known as God. Somehow that's not the sort of thing that I'm sure in his modesty he would say, but it's quite ironic that non-Baha'i classmates would say this. Of course, then on the 28th of November 1921, Abdu'l-Baha passed away. We have a picture here of Shoghi Effendi with Abdu'l-Baha, presumably taken during that period of time when Shoghi Effendi was his secretary right before he went to Paris. The Greatest Holy Leaf sent a telegram to Sir Wellesley Tudorpole, who was sort of a Baha'i. He was one of the people who pushed the British to make sure Abdu'l-Baha would be safe when Allenby was invading Palestine from Egypt. And of course, when Haifa was taken by Allenby, he immediately telegraphed everybody and said Abdu'l-Baha is safe. And so Sir Wellesley Tudorpole had a lot to do with that. So Tudorpole received this telegram that Abdu'l-Baha passed away. He immediately called Shoghi Effendi up at Oxford, which is 60 or 70 miles away, and told him, asked him to come to London immediately. Shoghi Effendi entered Tudorpole's office. Tudorpole wasn't in the office, and he saw the telegram lying on the desk and read it and was totally overwhelmed. With grief, he collapsed. Tudorpole was not in a position to break the news gently to him as a result. He actually had to go to bed for several days because he was so shocked. He loved Abdu'l-Baha really more than his own life. He wanted to go back to Palestine immediately, but there were some issues with his passport that had to be resolved, and it took almost a month. So he was finally able to get back to Haifa on the 29th of December of 1921, and a few days later, on January 3rd of 1922, the will and testament was read aloud in public for the first time. And that's when Shoghi Effendi found out that he was appointed by his grandfather as the guardian of the cause of God, Waliyamullah. He had no idea. He had thought he would just simply perhaps help to call for the election of the House of Justice or something like that. He had no idea. And of course, that was a second blow, the death of Abdu'l-Baha being the first and being appointed guardian was the second. Many people questioned whether he could serve as the head of the faith. In January of 1922, he was 24 years old. He didn't turn 25 until March. So he was quite young, quite green. Many people wanted him immediately to call for the election of the Universal House of Justice. That would stabilize things, and even the British were asking him to appoint a body or call for the election of a body that would work with him as a board of trustees for the faith. So people didn't trust him to be able to run things. And of course, at this very time, the covenant breakers seized the keys to the shrine of Baha'u'llah. The covenant breakers were living in the mansion, and the shrine of Baha'u'llah is right there, a few steps from the mansion. And the keys were in the hands of a Baha'i caretaker who would open it up every day for pilgrims, and they seized the keys from the caretaker. So at the top of the shock of being the guardian, he now had to sue the covenant breakers to get the building back. very difficult time. It was very clear reading the Will and Testament that it was not possible to elect the Universal House of Justice right away, because you have to have national spiritual assemblies, and the National Spiritual Assembly served as the electors, and there were no national spiritual assemblies. So Shoghi Effendi called for prominent Baha'is from various communities to come and meet with him. And January, February, and March, they were arriving, and he was meeting with them. They weren't all there at the same time. They all couldn't make it right away. There were no planes in those days. And he talked to them, briefed them about the will. They came to meet him, and he sent them home to establish national spiritual assemblies. So that was the main task that he accomplished during those first few months. And then March through December of 1922, he went to Switzerland to recover his health and to set himself, to make himself ready to be guardian, just like Jesus going into the wilderness, Baha'u'llah going into Kurdistan. For Shoghi Effendi, he had to go to Switzerland. So he went off into Switzerland, and he says somewhere that he wrestled with himself until he could turn himself completely over to the faith, because the only way to be the guardian of the Baha'i faith was to have no personal life at all, to be 100% the guardian and not the frail human being who might be swayed to be merciful to people who the faith couldn't be merciful to. So it was very difficult, and he used this time in Switzerland to prepare himself spiritually, as well as to overcome the shock of the passing of Abdu'l-Baha and the shock of being made the head of the faith. Shoghi Effendi at one point identified 3 charters of the faith, and these 3 charters were the Tablet of Carmel that Baha'u'llah wrote, where he extols Mount Carmel, the Tablets of the Divine Plan that Abdu'l-Baha wrote to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada in 1915 and 16, I think it was, 14 and 15, and finally the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha, which we've already mentioned. The Tablet of Carmel was the spiritual blueprint for building the administrative and spiritual center of the faith in Haifa. Without the Tablet of Carmel, you could easily argue that the seat of the House of Justice should be built over by Bahji, where Baha'u'llah is buried, for example. Abdu'l-Baha had wanted to be buried halfway between Bahji and the shrine of the Baba on Mount Carmel. Maybe you'd want to put the seat of the House of Justice there. But it became very clear from the Tablet of Carmel that these things were to go on Mount Carmel. So that becomes a major responsibility of the guardian. The Tablets of the Divine Plan give the responsibility of spreading the Baha'i faith to the entire world, to the North American Baha'is, and so that had to be systematized, and that's another task the guardian took upon himself to do. And this, of course, was not possible without some kind of structure which the local and national spiritual assemblies would provide. And so the Will and Testament provided him with a blueprint for that. So those are 3 very clear responsibilities that the guardian had as a result of those 3 particular documents. In addition to that, the Will and Testament gave Shoghi Effendi the infallible authority to interpret the writings of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Baha. And so a 4th clear responsibility of Shoghi Effendi was to interpret the writings. And then, based on the ability to interpret infallibly, the guardian had the authority to translate the texts in a way that carried their meaning properly and exactly. And so that becomes a 5th priority for the guardian. So you have 3 that are coming out of the Will and Testament: building the institutions, interpreting the writings, translating the writings. And then 2 other mandates: spreading the faith to the whole world from the Tablets of the Divine Plan, and building the World Center on Mount Carmel from the Tablet of Carmel. So those, I think, describe Shoghi Effendi's ministry fairly well, those 5 priorities that he had. And much of the rest of what I'm going to cover really goes over those priorities. First of all, the spread of the organization, which was really essential for this all to succeed, the others to succeed as well. In England, they elected 3 local spiritual assemblies in 1922 and 1923. I think in 22 they may have only elected 2 of them and then elected the 3rd one in 1923. Shoghi Effendi told the English Baha'is who met with him in 1922 to go back, get these local assemblies established, and elect a national spiritual assembly. And so in 1923, they had a electoral vote, a postal vote. Every single English Baha'i voted for members of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of England, and they had a sort of quota where there would be one from Bournemouth, one from Manchester, and the rest would all be from London. And that was the election of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of England. And the Guardian recognized that election, which we would consider quite irregular by our modern standards, as the election of a National Spiritual Assembly. At the same time, the Baha'is in Germany and Austria elected a National Spiritual Assembly, and the Baha'is in India and Burma together elected a National Spiritual Assembly. The Guardian was the one who said that Germany and Austria should be a unit, India and Burma should be a unit, and that continued right up until after World War II. In the United States, there was already a Baha'i Temple unity, which had been first elected in 1909. You had delegates coming from the different communities, meeting annually in Chicago and electing a 9-member executive board. They immediately renamed themselves the National Spiritual Assembly. So in 1922 or 23, I don't know which, the Baha'i Temple Unity called itself a National Spiritual Assembly, the 9-member executive committee. However, the procedures involved nominations, straw votes, things that we wouldn't consider proper elections by our modern standards, and so the Guardian did not recognize them as a National Spiritual Assembly until 1925. It's quite interesting to note that he recognized England's in 23, and they were pretty irregular too, but he held the U.S. to a higher standard. In 1921, the U.S. had maybe 8 LSAs, but by the end of the 1920s, it was 30 or 40. So very quickly, wherever there were 9 Baha'is, they elected local spiritual assemblies. And it's important to note that the result of the organization was a rapid increase in membership. Between 1899 and 1922, the number of Baha'is, 1926 even, the number of Baha'is in the United States stayed more or less the same, fluctuating around 1,500 or 1,200, something like that. And you can see the numbers here on this slide. But by 1936, it had doubled to 2,500, and by 1945, it had doubled again to 5,000. And that doubling was made possible because there was now a structure, there were now assemblies, there were feasts, there was an enrollment procedure, there was membership, there were committees. Before, the community had been a revolving door, and now it began really to grow. In Iran, the situation was difficult because there were lots and lots of people who said they were Baha'is, maybe even 500,000 people who considered themselves Baha'is. But many of them were not willing to put their names on a membership list because there was too much of a risk with the police cracking down on the Baha'is and persecuting the Baha'is. There had been a Central Spiritual Assembly first elected in 1898, I believe was the year. The Hands of the Cause actually initially appointed people, and then the Hands of the Cause themselves and the appointed people were the Central Spiritual Assembly. Then they gradually had a group of men electing in Tehran, and the Hands of the Cause were automatically on the body and some elected people. And by about 1915, the whole body was elected, 15 or so members. It served as the local assembly of Tehran and the National Spiritual Assembly of Iran simultaneously. Now, the Guardian wanted a National Spiritual Assembly. So the country was divided into administrative districts. LSA was elected for each province or district, and some of the cities had LSAs as well. And they began to assemble membership lists, and the Guardian insisted on membership lists. It wasn't until 1934 that a convention could be held with delegates from recognized Baha'is who could vote, and then the result was considered a National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Persia. So it took quite a while for the Iranian Baha'is to achieve the level of organization the Guardian expected, even though they were electing bodies all the way back to the late 19th century. Elsewhere, Egypt and Sudan, 1924, had one National Spiritual Assembly. Iraq formed its own in 1931. Australia and New Zealand jointly formed a National Assembly in 1934. Turkmenistan and the Caucasus both had national assemblies by 1925. So by mid-1930s, there were 10 National Spiritual Assemblies in the world, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus North America, the US and Canada, was 6th. England was 7. Germany and Austria was 8. India and Burma was 9. Iran was 10. So those are the 10 that they had. Then the situation really became very difficult, and the number of national spiritual assemblies began to shrink because of situations in the world. There was persecution in the Soviet Union and under the Nazis. The temple in Ashgabat in Turkmenistan was confiscated in 1928, was leased back to the Baha'is for a while, but then in 1938 there was a systematic persecution. Most of the men were imprisoned and then sent to exile in Siberia, where many died. The women and children were sent back to Iran. Ashgabat was only about 20 miles from the Iranian border. The Baha'is, they were all Persian speaking, so they could go back to Iran. The house of worship was totally confiscated. During the war, it was used as a factory. For a while, it was also used as an art museum. And then an earthquake severely damaged it in 1948. An earthquake that leveled Ashgabat and killed maybe 100,000 people. No one knows. And then in 1963, the Ashgabat temple had to be demolished because it was in such bad shape that it simply was being to fall down anyway. So the Soviets demolished it, and that was the end of the National Assembly of Turkmenistan. The National Assembly of the Caucasus were destroyed by Stalin, basically. The German Baha'i community was banned in 1937. Jewish Baha'is like Lydia Zamenhof, the daughter of the founder of Esperanto, were sent off to concentration camps and died in gas chambers. Many of the Baha'is of Christian background, the men were drafted and died in the war. So that was very bad, very difficult situation. The Iraqi community was badly persecuted. Baha'u'llah's home in Baghdad was confiscated from them. The Egyptian community was persecuted. The Indian and Burmese communities were very small, very poor, and able to do very little. The Australian and New Zealand community only had 100 or so members. And so if you look at the world in the mid-30s, the Baha'i organization is shrinking, and the only community the Guardian could really count on was the North American community with its 3,000 or 4,000 Baha'is growing towards 5,000. Very difficult situation. And one that, of course, he launched the 7-year plan, as we will see in a minute, using the North Americans as the executors of the plan. Turning to other things, though, Shoghi Effendi was a prolific writer, and we have 34,000 documents in the World Center's archives from him or written on his behalf, over 5 million words. We have over 5 million words from Abdu'l-Baha, over 5 million words from the Bab, and over 6 million words from Baha'u'llah. So we have vast amounts of text in Haifa from the central figures in Shoghi Effendi. Much of what Shoghi Effendi wrote, of course, were letters. The only book he ever wrote actually was God Passes By. But the letters were compiled together and published in volumes. And he began to write a series of very important epistles, public letters to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, starting in 1929. And these were then published as the volume called The World Order of Baha'u'llah. Before 1929, and a little bit afterwards, he was writing a series of shorter letters, which were published as a book called Baha'i Administration. And it's a very important book to look at. In Baha'i Administration, this is where he first says elect local and national spiritual assemblies, start literature review. He gives transliteration, the transliteration system that we use today, spelling words. He talks about going to Switzerland. All of these basic letters of the early years of the guardianship are published in Baha'i Administration. And most of those are letters of 2 or 3 or 4 pages in length, maybe 5 pages. The World Order of Baha'u'llah, February of 1929, was a radically different thing. It was a much longer letter, 30 or so pages. And then a year later, March of 1930, the World Order of Baha'u'llah Further Considerations was published. Again, it's an extensive letter. The goal of a new world order, November of 1931, 18 months or so after that first letter, was again a large document. The golden age of the cause of Baha'u'llah, March 1932. He's back doing it in the spring. You'll notice basically every year he's writing something. America and the Most Great Peace, April of 1933. Again, a year it has elapsed before he produces yet another important essay about the nature of the faith. And that one talks particularly about the destiny of America and the goals of the American Baha'i community. Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, February of 1934, again a year has passed. This is perhaps one of the most important letters the Guardian has ever written. It's the document which defines the station of the Bab, the station of Baha'u'llah, the station of Abdu'l-Baha, and the nature, and sort of you could say the station of the administrative order, both the guardianship and the House of Justice. A pivotal document to study, to understand who the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Baha were. And of course, at this point, many of the American Baha'is thought Abdu'l-Baha was the return of Christ. And so the dispensation of Baha'u'llah alleviated their concerns, clarified their confusion, and provided a very clear definition of who Abdu'l-Baha was, really for the first time. These are the kinds of things that could have caused schism and sect formation in a Christian-type situation in the past. The nature of Christ took 300 years of fighting for the Christians to come up with a consensus, and here Shoghi Effendi gave it to everybody in the course of about 60 pages. Then, after a 2-year break, the unfoldment of world civilization in 1936 was the last of these essays that were then compiled together as the World Order of Baha'u'llah. Very, very important collection of the letters of Shoghi Effendi about the nature of the Baha'i faith. Then, December of 1938, we have the Advent of Divine Justice, an extremely important letter to this day, centrally important for understanding the growth of the faith. He talks a lot about the need of a chaste and holy life. He talks a lot about the high standards of a rectitude of conduct, and he talks about freedom from racial prejudice. These are the three things: a high standard rectitude of conduct, a chaste and holy life, and freedom from prejudice are the three most important hallmarks of the spiritual and moral life of a Baha'i. And so he defines the spiritual and moral standards of the faith in the Advent of Divine Justice. And of course, in his section on freedom from racial prejudice is where he talks about the most vital and challenging issue facing the American Baha'is, which is racial prejudice. So this document is a precious document for us to understand how we are to live, how we are to behave, and how we are to teach the faith through our example. Then, a year and a quarter later, the Promised Day has come. This is the beginning of World War II, and it's a very, you might say, apocalyptic letter talking about the dark days that have come to the earth, the violent wind of God that is shaking all the institutions of humanity. And he talks a lot about the fall of the ecclesiastics, the fall of the monarchs, the destruction of empires, the loss of temporal power of the Pope, the loss of respect of ecclesiastical institutions and the institutions of the Islamic clerical hierarchy as well. It's quite a remarkable letter. It reflects the dark days that it's written in. Then, of course, in the Nowruz 1944, the 100th anniversary of the growth of the faith, he releases God Passes By, a history of the Baha'i faith during its first century, 1844 to 1944. And again, it's extremely important to study because there's a section there where he basically says, these are the most important works by the Bab. These are the most important works by Baha'u'llah. He describes each one. So if you want to know what the most important works are, he gives them in order. He talks about their key characteristics, their key value. And it's an extremely important book to understand the history of the faith, the nature of the contribution of Baha'u'llah, the nature of the role of Abdu'l-Baha in the faith, the role of the Baha'i institutions. It's a priceless source of guidance for a historian and just general understanding of the history of the community. After 1944, he didn't ever write anything lengthy again. He wrote sometimes some things of 10 or 15 pages, and they were compiled into various books. But at this point, the Baha'i community had gotten so large, he was so busy, he no longer had the time to write anything lengthy. And it's sort of a loss, but it was sort of inevitable too. Then, of course, there are the translations that he did. He started translating as Abdu'l-Baha's secretary in 1918, so he had experience doing that quite far back, and he'd gone to Oxford to improve his English. Of course, he translated the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha into English right away, 1922. It didn't appear right away. The Friends didn't have access to it, the whole thing at first. First, he gave them selections of it, a compilation of parts of it, passages from it. But then the whole thing was released a few years later. He translated the Kitab-i-Agan by Baha'u'llah in 1931, the Hidden Words in 1932, Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah in 1935, which is a collection of 160 or 180 passages from the writings of Baha'u'llah, which are exemplary of the basic teachings of Baha'u'llah. It's a very nice book to start studying the faith using. Prayers and Meditations, 1938, very little studied by the Baha'is, unfortunately. It's a beautiful compilation of prayers and of just poetical texts by Baha'u'llah about divine topics. Then Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, 1941, the last major work by Baha'u'llah, translated by Shoghi Effendi into matchless English. And then, of course, other than the writings of Baha'u'llah, he also translated The Dawnbreakers in 1932, a history by Nabil of the early days of the faith. And he encouraged the publication of Baha'u'llah and the New Era into many, many languages. He saw it as a basic manual for all the Baha'is to have a summary of the basic teachings of the faith in a single volume and have it available in all the languages in the world: Urdu, Burmese, Albanian, German, English, etc. And so he encouraged the translations, and Baha'u'llah, the New Era, was often the first thing translated into a language in those days. Some of the chapters had been read and approved by Abdu'l-Baha, and so the volume had a very high level of quality. Of course, today it would have to be rewritten again and again. We now have institutions. We have core activities that didn't exist. So there are many things now that are simply not covered by that book. But it was the classic work for many, many years for understanding the basics of the faith. Of course, one must mention his marriage to Mary Maxwell. She was born in 1910 in Montreal after May Maxwell and William Sutherland Maxwell had asked Abdu'l-Baha to pray for them to have a child, and he said that he would pray for them. Abdu'l-Baha came to Montreal and stayed in the Maxwell home in 1912, and Mary Maxwell, at age 2, remembered him, met him, and of course would later on remember him from that day forward. She went on pilgrimage with her mother, I think at some point in the 20s after Shoghi Effendi was guardian, but she was, of course, very young at that point. In 1937, she was 27, probably 26 years old when they arrived on pilgrimage in January. And a mere, about a month and a half later, Shoghi Effendi proposed marriage to her. And May Maxwell immediately cabled William Sutherland and said, "Come to Haifa." And Mary cabled her father and said, "May I marry the guardian?" Which, of course, he said yes to. And so the marriage occurred on March 24th, 1937, a little over 2 months after the guardian, after they had arrived on pilgrimage. The guardian had met this young woman as a young adult for the first time. Of course, it was a remarkable marriage that continued 20 years until the guardian's passing in 1957. She was utterly devoted to him. He, of course, gave her the title Ruhiyya Khanum, and so she was known as Ruhiyya Khanum subsequently. And after the death of the guardian, she continued his memory, traveling the world, serving the faith, helping to build the institutions, really right up to the end of her life. World War II and the establishment of the nation of Israel were huge tests and dangers for the Baha'i World Center. There was the possibility that the Nazis would conquer Palestine from the British, but Rommel was turned back after crossing most of the Sahara. The Germans conquered Crete. There was the possibility that the Germans would use Beirut and head south from French-controlled Lebanon, because Vichy France was controlling Lebanon, but then the British and the Free French forces captured Lebanon from Vichy and was no longer controlled by the Nazis. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was the leading Muslim central leader of Muslims in Jerusalem was an enemy of the faith, and many others in Haifa and in Jerusalem were enemies of the faith. So it was very dangerous. Shoghi Effendi, however, remained there, and of course the British continued to control Palestine and remained reasonably safe. Then after the war ended, about 1 million Jews who had survived the Holocaust arrived, many of them sneaking into the country illegally and building up the population that could then become Israel. And the United Nations agreed to partition the British-controlled area of Palestine into an Arab-controlled area and a Jewish-controlled area. The Arab-controlled area being the country of Jordan, of course, because there was no Palestine separate from Jordan in those days. Akka was to be in Arab Palestine, and Haifa was to be in Jewish Palestine. And so the Baha'i shrines were to be in two different countries. But of course, the Israeli War of Independence changed all that. The Israelis expanded their borders immensely, consolidated their control into a single large chunk instead of series of separate enclaves. And missiles fell from the sky, but none of the Baha'i properties were ever damaged. And the war ended with the shrines all being in one country, and that country being reasonably peaceful and stable. And so the Guardian was then able to start building the Shrine of the Baha and the Archives building. Some more pictures of Shoghi Effendi in middle age. The one on the right looks like he was perhaps during his Africa trip. He crossed Africa twice, once in the 20s, and the second time coming back from England. It was impossible during the war to cross the Mediterranean, so he took a ship to Cape Town, and then from there took the railroad the length of Africa back to Palestine, going mostly through British colonies all the way up. The railroad in those days, you could do that. You can't do that anymore. Developing the World Center was, of course, one of his priorities, and it went all the way back to 1923 when he got the Shrine of Baha'u'llah back from the Covenant Breakers. In 1929, he was able to purchase the mansion of Bahchi and get it from the Covenant Breakers. There was holes in the roof. It was in dilapidated condition. So he had to repair the mansion and set it up so that it could be a place of pilgrimage. And then gradually he was able to acquire more and more land around Bahchi, and eventually he was even able to acquire the houses that the Covenant Breakers, the members of Muhammad Ali's family, were living there, right, on the property, Bahchi property, right up until the 50s, when he was able to get the property, purchase their property, and expropriate some cases, and establish Bahchi as a place of pilgrimage. In 1932, he built this shrine, this little marble monument on the right, and interred Bahiya Khanum there. This is right when she passed. He was also able to reinter Nawab and Mirza Mahdi, Nawab being Baha'u'llah's first wife and his consort in all the worlds of God. Mirza Mahdi being Abdu'l-Baha's younger brother, who died in 1868 when he fell through the skylight on the roof of the prison and died. And they had both been buried over in Akka, and their bodies were located and moved to a place next to Bahiya Khanum's burial place. And then also Monire Khanum, Abdu'l-Baha's wife, was buried there too. And the monument gardens that were developed with these four shrines then becomes the sort of the focal point for an arc above them on the mountain, along which the five major buildings of the Baha'i World Center were to be built. So here you have the monument gardens. You have on the right the Shrine of Baha'u'llah without the superstructure. You'll notice that there are 3 rooms across the front and 2 on the side. Shoghi Effendi then added another set of 3 behind, so that instead of it being 2 by 3, it was 3 by 3, and there were 9 rooms. That put the Bab buried in the very central room of the 9. And then, of course, Abdu'l-Baha was buried in the center room in the front 3. And so you had the side rooms as places where people could go pray. And the back 3 rooms, which are currently empty, were temporarily the International Archives before an archives building was built. Here's the archives building on the left. It was completed in 1957, just about the time Shoghi Effendi passed, with the Shrine of the Bab on the right, and also behind, on the left, behind the archives building. It was completed in the 1950s with a marble superstructure built over the original sandstone building that Abdu'l-Baha had built. Here's the mansion of Bahji, beautified with beautiful gardens around it, all repaired. The property originally only was 1,000 square meters. 1,000 square meters is only about 100 feet by 100 feet. It's not very big. Eventually, the property expanded to be 26 hectares or 60 acres. And of course, the beautiful red pathways around the gardens were made from the roofing tiles of the roofs of the houses that the covenant breakers had occupied there for many years. Then finally, he was able to implement the divine plan, and I'm not giving these necessarily in chronological order because they're all occurring at the same time, but I have to put the 5 in some sort of order. He first was encouraging the Baha'is to start a plan for unified action as far back as the 20s, and you soon did have an effort to teach the faith systematically. In the U.S. Plan for Unified Action 26 to 28, another one from 31 to 34. In 36, Shoghi Effendi wrote the U.S. Baha'i National Convention and urged them to settle at least one Baha'i in every state in the U.S. and in every republic of Latin America by 1944. And we see in that the nucleus of some of the goals of the 7-year plan, which he actually launched 1 year later at the convention in 1937. It had 3 goals, one of which was an LSA in every state, but also in every province of Canada. So he added that. Open every republic in Latin America to the faith, which means at least one Baha'i in every republic, and complete the exterior ornamentation of the house of worship in Wilmette, which, of course, they had been building throughout the 20s. Up to that point, traveling teachers had been used, but this was not sufficient to reach these goals because people had to go actually move. So people settled in cities where there were no Baha'is, and this was called pioneering. And this was the beginning of the institution, if you want to call it that, of pioneering. And Baha'is were encouraged to hold meetings in their houses, which we then called firesides. And that was really the beginning of the fireside in the 1930s as well. By 1944, when the first 7-year plan ended, there was indeed a local spiritual assembly in every state of the U.S., in every province of Canada, and there were 10 local spiritual assemblies in Latin America. All the republics had been opened, and there were a large number of LSAs as well. By 1947, by 1946, there were 27 LSAs in Latin America. So there was rapid growth of the faith. During World War II, it was the only place you could try to grow the faith. And then after the war, the effort continued. There was a 2-year break between 44 and 46, and then a second 7-year plan was launched. And again, the Guardian only gave this to the Baha'is of North America. He called for the Canadians to elect their own National Spiritual Assembly in 1948, which they did. And once they did, he gave them a 5-year plan, 48 to 53. He called upon an election of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of South America and a National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Central America. So these were national spiritual assemblies for big regions of many countries, and this was also accomplished in 51 as he requested. The interior of the house of worship in Wilmette was completed so that that building could be dedicated in 1953 when the second 7-year plan ended. And then the National Spiritual Assembly in Germany was also reelected in 1946. Many Americans and Persians began to go to Europe after the war ended, and the Baha'i faith began to grow in Europe quite rapidly as well, though that became a goal of the crusade, the 10-year crusade. It was not yet a goal of this plan. Also, during the second 7-year plan, the first local spiritual assembly in North America on an Indian reservation was established on the Omaha Indian Reservation in 1948. And the Lofts, he was Mohawk and she was, I can't remember Wyandotte maybe, I can't remember what tribe she was from. They settled on the Tyendinaga Mohawk Reserve in Ontario, where he was originally from. And this was the beginning of the effort to take the Baha'i faith to First Nations in Canada. Other places around the world also established their own national plans, and these were plans not given by the Guardian, but these were spontaneously developed by these various Baha'i communities. The British had a 4-year plan, the Iraqis a 3-year plan, the Egyptians set goals to achieve by 1953. It wasn't really quite a plan, I guess. The Australians and New Zealanders together developed a plan, again, ending in 53. The Germans had a plan that was from 47 to 52. The Indians, of course, this was the time when Pakistan and Bangladesh were becoming separate from India, and so you had a huge amount of chaos and unrest in the Indian subcontinent at this time. But nevertheless, the Indian National Assembly managed to open the Panchgani, the New Era School in Panchgani, and they created a 4-year plan, 46 to 50, for the growth of the faith in the Indian subcontinent. And the Iranians had a 45-month plan as well. So everybody was doing plans at this time based on the plan given to the North Americans. After World War II, with the growth of the faith worldwide, Shoghi Effendi needed a lot more help in Haifa, and so he began to build up the secretariat. By the 1950s, it took him 2 to 3 hours every day just to read minutes, newsletters, and correspondence. It was just coming in with such a great rate that he couldn't completely keep up. So in 1951, he appointed the International Baha'i Council, and this was a body of 7 or 9 Baha'is, I don't remember how many there were initially, who were to meet with real estate and construction people. They were responsible for the contracts for getting materials for the Shrine of the Bab, for example, and for the International Archives building. And they were to meet with representatives of the State of Israel as well. So they carried out these external affairs work for Shoghi Effendi on his behalf, and he assigned tasks to the individual members of the institution. The International Baha'i Council apparently never met even once as an institution. It was, in that sense, a paper institution with people who had titles, and Shoghi Effendi gave these people who had titles tasks to do. He did say, however, that eventually the International Baha'i Council should be an elected body. In December of 1951, he appointed 12 individuals as hands of the cause of God, which was the first time he had made a public appointment of hands who were alive. He mentioned several people as hands, such as Mr. Gregory, as a hand when they died. Martha Root, he had said, was a hand when she passed away. In February of 52, he appointed 7 more, raising the total number of hands to 19. And then October of 57, 1 month before he passed away, he raised the total number of hands to 27. And in his letter, he referred to them as the chief stewards of the faith. This was a title which then gave him the authority to keep things going on his behalf after his passing. 53 to 63 was to be the 10-year crusade, which he announced in 1953, and it was the most ambitious plan the faith had ever seen. At that point in 1953, there were 12 national spiritual assemblies in the world, the most recent one being Italy and Switzerland, which was elected in 52, or maybe it was even in Resvan 53, actually. And so these 12 national assemblies all were given goals. So they all had things that they had to do. The number of places with Baha'is, the number of countries which had Baha'is was to double from 128 to 259. The number of national spiritual assemblies was to increase to 57, more than a 4-fold increase. People had to be reached in rural areas. He needed a lot more staff in Haifa and began to ask people to come and work for him there. This is the time when mass teaching first begins to develop. Kiribati, Mentawai Islands of Indonesia, Bolivia, Malwa in India, Uganda, Chile, Ecuador, Kenya, and all these places, people beginning to reach out to native peoples and bringing in large numbers of people into the faith. 1,300 people went pioneering out of their countries to other places during this plan. The number of local spiritual assemblies worldwide went from 611 to 3,551. The number of localities went from 2,425 to 11,210, and the Baha'i population in the world doubled to 408,000 people. So this was an immense expansion of the faith, and Shoghi Effendi planned the whole thing. In the U.S., the Baha'i population went from 7,000 to 10,000. And of course, probably of those 10,000, maybe as many as 1,000 of them went pioneering at one time or another. So it was a huge demand on the resources of the American Baha'i community to run this. They're part of the 10-year crusade. This all happened in spite of severe persecution of the faith in 1955-56. After the CIA coup in 1953, there was a severe outbreak of persecution against the Baha'is. The National Baha'i Center was confiscated. Its dome was destroyed. The House of the Bab was attacked and severely damaged. The Guardian described an orgy of senseless murder, rape, pillage, and destruction. Baha'is were being executed, martyred on the streets. The Iranian Baha'i community responded with discipline. They protested. They didn't respond with violence. Shoghi Effendi organized a massive international response, and the international outcry against this persecution shocked the Iranian government, and they stopped the persecution. In 1960, the Egyptian government banned all Baha'i institutions in Egypt, and that was not reversible, unfortunately. And in 1962-63, 14 Moroccan Baha'is were arrested and 3 sentenced to death, and the international outcry against that again caused all of them to be released from jail, and no one was executed. That, of course, had to be coordinated by the hands of the cause, and that was also true of the 1960 efforts. So these occurred during the 10-year crusade, but after the passing of Shoghi Effendi. As I mentioned, in October of 57, Shoghi Effendi referred to the hands as the chief stewards of Baha'u'llah's embryonic world commonwealth, who had been invested by the unerring pen of the center of his covenant with the dual function of guarding over the security and of ensuring the propagation of his father's faith. So that's just weeks before he dies unexpectedly on November 4th, 1957. A huge shock to the Baha'i community when Shoghi Effendi, just 60 years old, passed away. Here's his grave, photo of his grave, north of London in what used to be called the Great Northern Cemetery. It now has a new name. I don't remember what the new name is. I was just there a few weeks ago when I referred to it as the Great Northern Cemetery. People said, no, that's not what it's called anymore. It's a magnificent grave, and it is surrounded by the graves of many British Baha'is as well. The passing of Shoghi Effendi was a shock, and you might say it was a dilemma, because the Baha'i community understood the guardianship to be a permanent, fixed, and essential element of the administrative order. They assumed that it was going to go on forever. They knew that only descendants of Baha'u'llah could be appointed guardian. Many people speculated that maybe Shoghi Effendi and Ruhiyah Khanum had a baby, and the baby was off in a Swiss boarding school away from the Baha'is so that they wouldn't corrupt him. But nobody really knew. Of course, it was very clear that there was no child. And once that was clear, well, then what do you do with the guardianship? Do you abandon the guardianship and just go with the House of Justice? You could do that because, after all, there's nothing saying the House of Justice has to be called, the election has to be called by a guardian. There's nothing at all restricting that. In fact, Abdu'l-Baha had even written a letter to someone and asked him to call for the election of the House of Justice if Abdu'l-Baha himself had then been sent off to the Sahara, the southern Sahara, in a new exile where he would die. On the other hand, people could argue this is such an essential element for the faith, we need to reinterpret Abdu'l-Baha's will and testament in a way that would allow the appointment of additional guardians. But who would do that? Do the hands have the authority to do that? No. Would the House of Justice have the authority to do that? Maybe. Eventually the House said no, it does not have that authority. But people in the 1950s didn't know. So there was a lot of confusion, a lot of worry, a lot of angst. And of course, Charles Mason Reamy was willing to do some reinterpreting of the situation, but the hands of the cause, who were now in charge of the faith, were not. The hands immediately met after the funeral, determined that there was no will and testament of Shoghi Effendi. They determined that it was not possible for them to appoint a guardian or to see someone to be a guardian, and they said that to be the case. They met annually, and it was a very long, difficult discussion because some of the Persians didn't speak English. None of the English speakers, native English speakers, knew Persian. There were 2 hands that knew both languages who had to do all the translating. They decided they'd appoint a 9-member body to stay in Haifa and coordinate the 10-year crusade until it ended, because the 10-year crusade was Shoghi Effendi's mandate for spreading the faith around the world. So they were going to complete that, and they did, of course, with great success. And they decided they would then elect the International Baha'i Council in 1961, as Shoghi Effendi said, it would be elected as a precursor body to the Universal House of Justice. And then in 1963, when the crusade ended, the Universal House of Justice would be elected by the members of all the national assemblies based on the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha and the instructions there. This, of course, didn't sit well with Charles Mason Remy, who had been appointed as president of the International Baha'i Council by Shoghi Effendi. And Shoghi Effendi had said the International Baha'i Council would be the forerunner body of the Universal House of Justice. So Remy argued that by being appointed president of the International Baha'i Council, Shoghi Effendi had made him his successor. But of course, by that logic, that would make Remy a guardian as soon as Shoghi Effendi made him president, because the head of the House of Justice is supposed to be the guardian, remember? But that would mean there were two guardians at the same time. And obviously that wasn't the case. Shoghi Effendi was not treating Remy as if he were a second guardian or a co-guardian or anything like that. So that's simply not reasonable, logical. It's not a reasonable interpretation of the writings of the guardian or the writings of Abdu'l-Baha. The will of Abdu'l-Baha, will and testament, also said that the guardian had to appoint a successor who had to be a male descendant of Baha'u'llah, and that the choice would then be ratified by a 9-member committee of the hands. And that had not happened either, neither the appointment nor the ratification. So you couldn't come up with a way to create a guardian without really stretching things beyond reasonable interpretation, and no one felt they had the authority to do that. Even the House of Justice decided they couldn't do that. So Remy proposed it, and everybody said no. Remy had a very small following of perhaps 100 or maybe even 200 people worldwide. He didn't even realize, if you want to put it that way, he was the guardian until 1959, when the hands decided to elect the International Baha'i Council in 1961. This, of course, would terminate his appointment as its president, so that, upset him. He finally declared himself in 1960, and only 5 members of one National Spiritual Assembly, the French National Assembly, followed him. All the other national assemblies rejected his claim. Subsequently, he appointed International Baha'i Council himself, which of course suggested that he might appoint a House of Justice or seat for the election of his own House of Justice. He appointed someone to be the third guardian. He then forgot he had appointed a third guardian, appointed someone else as a third guardian, and he disbanded his International Baha'i Council as well, as he was getting quite old and senile. Eventually, the 2 third guardians found out that each had an appointment letter, and they wrote Remy and asked, well, who did you really want? And Remy didn't answer the question. The first one who was appointed said, well, he was senile when he appointed the second one. The second one said he was unappointing the first one by appointing the second one. And so the Remy movement split in half when Remy died in 1974 at age 100. And that was the end of the Remyites. They actually have continued to exist, but they've continued to shrink in size, and today, I doubt there are even 50 members, and they're all old. Mostly they're old, or they're the children of the founders. Well, the hands, of course, disqualified themselves from being elected to the Universal House of Justice. The Baha'i world sent their members of their national spiritual assemblies to Haifa in April of 1963. The election was held in the house of Abdu'l-Baha, and the result was the election of 9 individuals to the first Universal House of Justice. The 10-year crusade, which ended at Rezvan, was a huge success with 56 of the 57 national assemblies elected. It was impossible because of unrest in Afghanistan to elect an assembly at that time. One was, of course, elected later. The growth of the faith, it doubled in size. It was more than all the growth of the previous century. So the 10-year crusade was a fitting ending for the guardianship and a fitting tribute to the great accomplishments of Shoghi Effendi. So that ends my presentation on Shoghi Effendi, and perhaps now we can see what questions we have. And I'll see what we have here. I can pop them up. I don't know if we have any questions yet. We'll see what people can come up with here.
I just copied one into the chat for you, Rob.
Okay.
If you check mine.
Check the chat. Okay, I see the chat. Regarding the missing will of the guardian, has it ever been considered that it was discovered, stolen, or destroyed by one of the covenant breakers? No, that doesn't seem very likely. Shoghi Khanum puts it this way. First of all, people are supposed to write a will and a testament. The testament is your statement of faith. The dispensation of Baha'u'llah was Shoghi Effendi's statement of faith, because there he defines the station of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and of the administrative order. So by writing the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi had essentially written his testament. If you don't consider that his testament, then you consider his 5 million words as guardian his testament, certainly, which was summarized basically in the dispensation. The other purpose of a will is to dispose personal property. And the guardian really had no personal property. All of the houses and everything, the buildings, all belonged to the faith. So that particular aspect wasn't necessary. The third aspect that required a will was to appoint a successor. But he couldn't, because there were no members, male members of the family of Baha'u'llah who were alive and who were loyal to the covenant. All of his brothers, many of them had married into the covenant breaker families of the previous generation. The followers of Abdu'l-Baha's brother, who had, of course, done terrible things to Abdu'l-Baha and had opposed him and had caused severe difficulties for Abdu'l-Baha, managed to keep his imprisonment going, took money from him and said they weren't receiving the pensions when he was passing the pensions on, said that he was building an arsenal in the shrine of the Bab, when of course he wasn't. All of these individuals managed to convince some of Shoghi Effendi's brothers and sisters to marry into their family, and so the descendants of Abdu'l-Baha, Abdu'l-Baha's daughters, married into the family of Muhammad Ali, and therefore were all covenant breakers as well. So there were no male descendants of Baha'u'llah who could be appointed a guardian. And that's a situation that perhaps Shoghi Effendi felt as the guardian he couldn't interpret either, because there was nothing in the writings to interpret to solve that problem. That was an issue that required the legislation of the House of Justice. So those are the three basic issues that a will and testament had to address. And he didn't have to worry about the personal property. He'd already handled the testament, and he couldn't handle the issue of succession. So that's the answer I've gleaned from people about that particular issue.
I have another one here. Do you know anything about the letters of the guardian to the Iranian Baha'i community, and can you speak to them?
I don't know much about the letters Shoghi Effendi wrote in Persian. One particular massive letter that he wrote was basically his reconstruction or translation of God Passes By into Persian. Loh-e-Qarn, the tablet of the century or the centenary. And it's a remarkable 60, 70, 80 page tablet about the history of the faith during the first century of the growth of the faith. The other thing that Shoghi Effendi wrote in Persian, of course, were prayers, and the Persian friends often will chant prayers by Shoghi Effendi, but we don't have prayers of Shoghi Effendi available to us in English at the moment, at least. And if we did, I don't know whether we would use them, because we generally stick to the authoritative texts of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Baha anyway. Other than that, I really don't know much about the letters that Shoghi Effendi wrote in Persian. And for a long time, the Persian friends did not have access to God Passes By or to Ruler Baha'u'llah or Advent of Divine Justice or Promised Day Has Come. Those, of course, are all available in translation now in Persian. But for a long time, they didn't have those either. So in many ways, the Guardian's advice to the Westerners and to the Easterners were sort of separated, and perhaps that was useful. Paul Mantle notes that the George Ronald is now publishing Earl Redmond's book on the Knights of Baha'u'llah. And yes, I did hear something about that, Paul, but I haven't seen the book yet. This is a book, of course, about the lives of the various, well, probably the stories of the Knights of Baha'u'llah. I don't know how much it has of their lives per se. And then the, you don't mean the Knights of Baha'u'llah, actually. You mean the, maybe you do mean the Knights of Baha'u'llah. But there's also a book that's been published about the people who opened all the territories. Were those Knights of Baha'u'llah? Yeah, I guess those are the Knights of Baha'u'llah. Yeah. Those are the people who opened, during the 10-year crusade, many of those 200 or so countries that needed to be opened, countries and territories that needed to be opened. The last territory that hadn't been opened was actually opened in 1990 or so, and that was Mongolia. And that was Sean Hinton who went there. He was I think the last Knight of Baha'u'llah that was recognized by the House of Justice in that case.
Two questions here on Facebook. Are the current covenant breakers such as so-called Orthodox from the Rameites? Yes, the Orthodox Baha'is are one of the descendant groups from the Rameites. They were based in New Mexico, and their guardian was Marangella. I'm trying to think which Marangella's, Philip was his father. Joel Marangella. Joel Marangella was one of the two people the guardian appointed as guardian. And Joel Marangella appointed several of his sons as hands of the cause of God. And he passed away about 2 or 3 years ago and appointed another person who's Persian, I believe, as fourth guardian. So they've continued to exist, but I don't think they have more than 30 to 50 members. It seems like they're a very small group. And if they write letters like Rezvan letters, you end up quoting, praising all these individual people instead of institutions or countries or communities for achieving certain things. So they, near as I can tell, they're sort of on their last legs. Another group that exists was the Baha'is under the provision of the covenant in Montana, and they didn't actually have an official appointment from Shoghi Effendi. They were kind of hanging out there saying that they were accepting Pepe Rimi as the right guardian. Pepe was an Italian kid or Italian man who Rimi adopted in the last years of his life, who never claimed to be guardian and who never had a letter from Rimi making him a guardian. And so they were saying that he was guardian, and they were under the provisions of the covenant kind of running things. And they were the people who were saying that the United States was about to be bombed by the Soviet Union and retreating into bomb shelters, and saying that New York is about to be nuked, and making all kinds of crazy prophecies that really made them a laughingstock. And also the study of a lot of rather strange anthropological research by the sociological research by the Department of Sociology of the University of Montana, which looked at them as an example of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you say and believe things that are clearly not true, and you know they're not true, and you're trying to hold together the fact that your beliefs aren't true. That causes cognitive dissonance, And so they've been a subject of study of cognitive dissonance. I have another question here. Can you confirm the account that Ruhi Afnan broke Shoghi Effendi's finger? I have no idea. I've never heard about that. I don't know about that. Ruhi Afnan was, I think, the second grandson of Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi being the oldest, and he served as Shoghi Effendi's secretary for a while. But he went off and did his own thing and associated with covenant breakers, so he was declared a covenant breaker. He became a kind of philosopher type and published some books about Spinoza and the Baha'i Faith or something like that, which I haven't read. What else do we have?
One in the chat there. If prayers of the guardian are okay in Farsi, why not also in English? Didn't know that.
Ask the House of Justice. I don't know the answer to that question. That would be interesting to know. What else do we have? Do we have anything else?
No, that's it. So one from me. So technically, the NSA of England was the first National Spiritual Assembly that was ever elected?
There were 3 in 1923. England, Germany and Austria, and then India and Burma. So those were the first 3 National Spiritual Assemblies, technically, in the world. And I don't know if any one of them was first. And I'm saying England, it might have been called Great Britain, or it might have been called the United Kingdom, or it might have been called the British Isles. I think it might have been called England at first, though. And then later on, of course, it became the National Assembly of the British Isles because it included Ireland as well. And today it's the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United Kingdom. But I'm not quite sure technically what it was called in 23. So.
Shoghi Effendi is now buried in London. What were the circumstances that put him there at that particular time?
Shoghi Effendi was in London with Ruhiya Khanum, and they were shopping for items for the International Baha'i Archives, because the International Baha'i Archives required a lot of antiques and other beautiful objects of furniture for housing, relics. And so they were there for that purpose. And when they traveled, they generally were traveling incognito. They didn't contact the Baha'is. So I don't think any of the Baha'is knew that they were there, as far as I know. So that was why they were there. Someone asked about Jack McLean's book. I just got 2 more after that. So I'll have to give Jack's book a plug, A Celestial Burning. And this is a very good review of the writings of Shoghi Effendi. A selective study of the writings of Shoghi Effendi is the subtitle, published by the Indian Publishing Trust, if I remember right. Jack even asked me to give it a plug today, but hey, Paul Mantle put it in there and asked for it, so I'm doing it because Paul asked, not because of Jack asked. Jack did ask, and I'm happy to mention his book because it's really quite a nice review of the writings of the Guardian. Ron says, was the Guardian fluent in Arabic, and did he interact much with the Arabic world? He was totally fluent with Arabic, Persian, English, and he also wrote French. So his French was good as well. And yes, he could write in Arabic quite well. He was, after all, being raised in an Arabic part of the world. So yes. Lynette says, thank you, and love Jack. So those are 2 other comments. I'm looking to see what else we have.
Did Shoghi Effendi ever consider his own successes that we know of?
You mean, did he ever comment about his own successes, you mean?
That was the literal copy of the question. I'm not sure.
Uh-huh. I don't think Shoghi Effendi would have ever attributed his successes to himself. He praised the Baha'is continuously about what they had accomplished. And I think the Guardian would have considered these the accomplishment of the Baha'i world, and not of the general who led them, in his modesty. The Guardian was a very modest person.
Did you know if the Guardian wore a Baha'i ring on his right small finger, and is that the right or best place to wear one? Do you know? Well,
it is normally right here. I don't happen to have one right now because mine flew off and I lost it back in January. Normally it's on the little finger on the right hand, isn't it? Or no, the middle finger. Maybe it's the middle finger, one of the middle fingers. I don't have it on, so I don't remember anymore. I don't know where that convention comes from either. I don't know how that developed right offhand. What else? Anything else?
I think that's all I'm seeing so far.
Well, we could wrap it up. I ran a little long. Oh, here's another question from Bob and another one from Ron. How nice. Bob LeBlanc, who's with Louise Prophet LeBlanc, who's going to be our speaker next month, happened to be driving along, and they're now about to pass the graveyard of Melba and Jim Loft. And we'll stop to say prayers there. The gravestone says, the guardian's obedient servants. The Lofts I mentioned were the ones who went to the Tyendinaga Mohawk Reserve in Ontario and first began to teach the faith to First Nations people systematically in Canada in the late 40s or early 50s. I don't remember the exact date. And of course, Louise Prophet LeBlanc will be speaking next month about her art and how it reflects the Seven Valleys, and she herself is a native First Nations artist in Canada, currently living in Quebec. Ron says, did Shoghi Effendi write a lot of letters to Arab Baha'is, such as in Egypt? What was the nature? I don't know about letters the Guardian wrote in Arabic, or how many letters he wrote in Arabic, or how much he wrote in Arabic. I really have no idea. And that's a fascinating question. It's too bad we can't ask Sohail Bushrui, who of course now has passed away. He would, I'm sure, know the answer to that one. Betty notes you wear the ring on the little finger on the right hand. And Dale asks, when will Susan Monick's presentation on Zoroaster be held? I thought it was today. Yeah, she had to go help her mother, and as a result, she's staying with her mother, and her mother's internet comes and goes, so she wasn't able to speak today, and we haven't yet rescheduled the talk. I'm guessing sometime in the fall, but November we've already got 3 things. October is not good. Maybe it'll be December. Maybe we'll just simply do 3 things in September. I don't know. So we'll let everybody know. And we have to wait also to see when Susan can get back home where she has reliable internet. I don't know how long she has to stay with her mother either. So we'll see.
Clarification, I read that question wrong. So just to re-clarify, did Shoghi Effendi ever consider his own succession that we know of?
Succession? I don't know the answer to that question. I really don't. And Betty notes that a statistical book says the National Spiritual Assembly of the British Isles was established in 1923, so that is the name. I don't know whether, Betty, whether it was called that in 23, though. That's what I was wondering, because I have seen it referred to as England. And all the local assemblies were in England at the time. But the British Isles certainly would have been the correct name until Ireland was spun off. And that's much later. That's in the maybe 1960 or so, something like that. Thank you for that. Well, if we don't have anything else, perhaps I will switch to the other PowerPoint just to mention quickly what's coming up so that you all know about our upcoming web talks. September 17th will be Louise Prophet LeBlanc's talk on her 7 caribou spirit bowls, which are bowls made of caribou hide, and how they relate to the 7 valleys. So we will have that presentation in September. In October, John Hatcher will be speaking about what the bicentenary of the birth of Baha'u'llah means to me. That, of course, is 1 week before the bicentenary. So that's it. That's the way we're going to be commemorating that particular event. And then on October 29th, Paul Hanley will be talking about his book 11. He's also giving a course, I think it starts on November 1st, based on that book, which is all about the idea of how do you create a viable world with 11 billion people living on it. That's the estimate of world population about 2050. Then in November, we have 3 talks by Robert Atkinson about basically the overall theme from duality to oneness is all about the establishment of the oneness of humanity. And in December, Elena Mustakova-Posart will be talking about a psychology that responds to our times, transforming inner oppression into awakened, aligned, and liberated spirit. So this will be one of our talks that relates to psychology. We've had several also with Michael Penn And, we're trying to do various themes. History is one, art is another, psychology is another, sustainability and the environment is another, equality of men and women, racism is another. And so we're trying to do web talks that represent many of these different themes. Coming up, we have various courses today. Building a World Federation has started, but we have plenty of room, and we would love to have more people register for it. And if you can't afford the $75, we can give you a discount. Just write me. Zoroastrian for Deepening and Dialogue starts on the 25th, and we're looking forward to that course as well. That's why we were originally doing this talk on Zoroastrianism, which will be rescheduled. On September 1st, a creative writing course begins with Sandra Hutchison, and we already have over a dozen people registered for that. The Baha'i Faith and Social Change is a brand new course that we've never offered before. The idea is to provide an overview of the nature of the Baha'i approach to social change and social development, you might say. And that course is going to be really a very good course. Starts on the 8th of September, and then Sustainable Development and the Prosperity of Humankind begins on the 10th. We're, of course, at womaninstitute.org, and we have our youtube.com/womaninstitute YouTube channel, and 8777-877-WOMEN is the way to reach us. So if you have any questions, we look forward to hearing from you, and we hope to see you again in another month with Louise Prophet LeBlanc's presentation about spirit bowls and the 7 balance. So thank you, everybody, for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a good day and enjoy the eclipse tomorrow. Bye-bye.